Hi, this is one of the Getting Started videos for the HL7 FHIR series. This particular video is navigating the HL7 FHIR website itself, and my name is Terry Sippel-Schmidt. FHIR is an acronym, and it stands for Fast Healthcare Interoperable Resources. It's an international standard published by HL7. The official standard itself is at this particular website at this URL. You can always also just put it into any search window and it'll come right up. There is no paper document for this particular standard. The standard is open and free, and the FHIR version that we are going to look at is version 4.0.1, often just simply referred to as FHIR R4. R5 is under development at this point, but has not yet been released. There are two parts of FHIR. One is the resources and the other is the APIs. These are the two primary parts that we're going to take a look at as part of this class. Finally, FHIR resources are object definitions or templates. Furthermore, all of the objects and all of the information in this particular website is normalized. And so what that means isn't repeated from page to page to page. Instead, it's linked. And so every object and reference is linked to the next object and reference. What that means in a very practical point of view is that there are a lot of links. And you just need to get used to how to manage that. So let's go take a peek at the FHIR standard itself. So this is the main web page of FHIR. And as you can see, it starts out by jumping right in. There are several tabs across the top, and we're going to take a quick view of some of these because sometimes it's more important or as important to know where not to go as to what to focus on. This web page is kind of sparse, but there's some good information on this home page, especially if this is the first time that you're investigating FHIR. There's an executive summary on this homepage that's worth looking at. There's also a couple other summaries, the developer's clinical introduction, architect's introduction, but probably you want to start at the executive summary if you're going to take a peek at these. There's some other information here, but we'll go through that over time. The second tab along the top is Getting Started. And this page also is a bit sparse because their assumption is that you're going to look for information in terms of getting started in other places. So this isn't some place that we're really going to spend too much time on. Documentation is the third tab. This is a summary, a list of all of the documentation that exists on the website. I'm going to be honest, it's linked into the place of context. So for example, if you need some of this documentation, there's a link to it in the context you're reading it in. So again, I don't go to this page very often. The next page is resources, or all the data models and all the information that we're going to be using. Quite arguably, this is the most important page on this website, and we're going to be spending a lot of time, especially in the first couple of classes, on this page. This page is so important that we're going to skip it for right now and come back to it at the end. The next two tabs are profiles and extensions. Profiles are a way to take all of these resources and say, out of the various things that that are defined in the HL7 standard, we're going to use these 5 things. And extensions is kind of the opposite, which is that the resources are intended to cover 80% of all the different use cases, which means that 20% of what you need isn't potentially going to be in that resource. So there's a way to extend the resources. Profiles and extensions will be covered in detail towards the end of the class. So we're going to skip those for now as well. You'll be directed there again later. Operations. You're going to hear a lot about APIs. So this particular web page goes through and it lists all the various APIs and all the different formats that can be used in the APIs. We're going to go through this in a slower manner, and we're going to go through it kind of more from a top-down approach as opposed to a list approach. So I want you to know that this web page is here if you're looking for a specific type of structure for an API, but we're probably not going to spend much time here either. And then finally, terminologies. Terminologies are all the different code sets, and it's the vocabulary, and it's how one physician speaks to another physician, and they're using the same words that mean the same things to them. In a computer, that's probably a code system, so that the code that I use means the same code to another computer system, and it's machine processable. FHIR does not tend to repeat code systems, but rather use code systems. And so you'll see a lot of links on this page. You'll see SNOMED, you'll see LOINC, You'll see ICD-9 and ICD-10 from the World Health Organization. You'll see RADLux. So this tends to be a link to a lot of other code standards, although when necessary, FHIR does actually define lists of codes. But this is also for the end of the class and not for today. So we're not going to jump into this one till the middle of the class. Let's instead go back to resources. Okay, now let's look down this page a bit. Now we're on the main resources page. Again, we've got a list of tabs across the top. So let's go see what's important in here. This is a list. This page, the categorized list, is all of the resources that exist in FHIR R4 based on different categories. And we'll come back to those in a minute. This page is that same list of resources, but here they're listed alphabetically. I'm going to be honest, sometimes when you're looking for something, it's easier to go to the alphabetical list and look it up alphabetically than to find it by the category. So I use categorized the most often, but I sometimes also used alphabetical. Let's continue down our tabs. Here we have R2. R2 is ancient. We don't need to go there. By maturity, we'll get to this later. You really don't need to use this. A security category, by standard status, if you're working on the standard itself, by committee, which committees are working on which resources. You really don't need any of these. Let's go back to categorized. Under the categories, there's 5 different levels or 5 categories. The first is foundation, and it's kind of like Legos. So this is your building block. This is how we define binary. This is how we define message headers. So these are really building block level resources. The next resource is that at the base level. And again, we're moving up the building blocks here. The next level is clinical, you can see here. And then we get into financial, and then finally specialized. Within each of these levels, you can see that they've categorized some of the information to be more logical. So the logical things are grouped together. So under clinical, we have a summary, and here you can see things like allergies and conditions and procedures. Under diagnostics, we have things like observations and reports and specimens. Under medications, we have medication requests and medication statements and immunizations. And so you can see how things are grouped together. Let's go jump into one of the resources themselves. We're going to start out by looking at a patient because the patient is arguably the most easy resource to understand. Okay, now we are on the patient resource page, and you can see that is listed right up here at the top. Again, we have a list of tabs across here, so let's talk about what those are. This is the content page. We'll come back to it in just a minute, but let's look at the other tabs briefly. Here's an examples page. Now, I'm sure that you've all heard as a computer science student, you should never code by example because sometimes the examples are wrong, they might be incomplete, and that's a true statement. But I would also tell you this, examples can be really useful if you're trying to understand. So here's a list of different kinds of examples for patients. Here's different IDs, don't worry about those. And here's the 3 different formats that you can use in HL7 FHIR: XML or extensible markup language, JSON or JavaScript object notation, and Turtle, which is, if you've ever used RFD or Sparkle, that's related to Turtle. Of those 3, we are going to focus strictly on JSON in this particular class because it's the most prevalent. So I just want to let you know that this examples page is here, and you'll be coming back to this at some point. Detailed descriptions is a link. So within the content, all of these things are linked to the one that you need. So you don't really read this page. You go back and link to it and click on these links when you need them. Mappings are mappings from other standards. So for example, this is often useful. We have mappings from HL7 version 2, which is the predecessor to FHIR, into the different FHIR. These are the FHIR elements, and here's where you pull them out of HL7 version 2. I'm going to warn you that these aren't always correct and that they're suggestions as opposed to anything more than that. Profiles and extensions. This tab can be really useful. There are profiles defined. This list isn't quite correct. We're going to ignore that for now. And there's also extensions. So for example, say that you would like to include citizenship, which is not part of the normal 80-20 rule, and 80% of the cases don't need citizenship, but you do. This will go through and it will tell you how to add citizenship to the patient resource. Operations has some of the query information on it, and R3 conversions is old and don't bother with it. So let's go back to the main content page. Every resource page is going to have scope and usage, and that's worth reading. Then we're going to come down here, and it's always going to be 8.1.2 is going to be the resource content. And look, we have more tabs across the top. Let's take a peek at those quick. Here's the structure of how you read this, but there's other ways to take a look at the same information. You can look at it graphically using Unified Modeling Language or UML, and sometimes this is helpful to see what kind of different links and how many times things can repeat out there. You can look at it XML. I'm not a fan. I think this is hard to read. For that matter, I even think the JSON is hard to read and the turtle is as well. This is a difference page, ignore it. And then finally, this tab is all, everything on one single page. Don't ever go there. Let's go back to structure. Okay, here we have the patient. And just to go through and give you some examples of what are the elements that make up this resource called a patient. So the elements, and these are the elements here, that define this patient include things like identifier or patient ID, a patient name, a phone number, patient gender, date of birth, whether they're deceased or not, address, marital status, and you can keep on going all the way down, and you can see all the different parts that FHIR has decided this is how you define 80% of the patients that we'll need. The next column is flags. I'll come back to that another time. The next column is cardinality. Cardinality is how many times is it required and how many times may it repeat. For example, a patient name is not required. So it's 0, you read this 0 to many. You read this one 0 to 1. So it's active, as an example, is not required. But if you do have it, you can only have one. So active will only appear once. Name, however, isn't required, but it can appear many times. There's different reasons that people have different names. And so you have to have that be a multiple valued field. The next category over is called type. And this defines the data type for this particular element. So as an example, birth date is of data type date, which we can go and take a look at how that's defined. Finally, the last column is description and constraints. And this is a really important column also. So as an example, gender, it's going to limit it to these particular values. And so it'll say that this is required. If you're not quite sure what one of these means, chances are that over here in the description, it'll tell you a little bit more about it. So I always read the definition of some of these elements, even if you think you know what it means. Photo means an image of the patient. Okay, that might be obvious, but maybe not. So those are the different sections of the structure table. The ones that we're going to look at are the elements, the name of the elements, the cardinality, how often is it required and how often can it repeat, the type, what's the data type, how is it formatted, and then description and constraints. Let's keep going down this page a bit further. We have terminology bindings, and terminology bindings is going to tell you what values can you have in some of these fields, for example, gender. We're going to skip constraints for right now. Now, this particular resource has a lot of discussion because people have a lot of different things going on. This section up here was about how you link different people and different patients. This section down here refers to gender and sex. Then you have relationships between mothers and newborns. Patients need to get merged. There's MPIs or master patient indexes, and I'm going to keep scrolling down. We have veterinary care specifics because FHIR also covers pets and animals. And then finally, at the end of every resource, there's a very important section here called search parameters. And if you've watched the API video, you'll know that one of the things in CRUDs or create, read, update, delete, and the S stands for search. So these are all of the search parameters that you can use on a patient. And these can get really interesting. For example, one of the search parameters that I can query on is name, because it's listed down here. Name will give me, say I put into the name Smith. Well, that's going to search for any part of any name string for a patient, whether it's first name, last name, middle name, previous name, It'll search every name string that exists. If you only want to search the family name, you have to use the query key of family. And that's only going to search then the family portion of the name. There's other examples like that. For example, address. Say I type in, I live in the state of Wisconsin, which is the WI. So say I put into that, I want to search address for WI. Well, I'm going to search every part of the address. I'm going to search the street name. I'm going to search the city name, and I'm going to search the state for WI for Wisconsin. Really what I want to use is this query key down here, address state. So this is a good set of information that you're going to need to know as we begin to develop APIs. And on that note, I'm going to jump back to my PowerPoint. All right, to finish up your quick recap of the FHIR HL7 website, there's your URL. You're going to want to go spend some time there. If you're looking at documentation at other websites, for example, U2 or other tutorials, always make sure that the documentation that you're looking at is for R4. It may say 4.0.1, but make sure it's R4. There's a lot of documentation out there still for R3. Always remember the JSON examples at the second tab at the top of every resource. Examples are often worth 1,000 words. Consider a second monitor if you don't already have one. This particular website is full of links. And if you only can use one small monitor to follow every link, and you can't open up separate windows, you're going to go a little bit crazy. As a matter of fact, to that end, you're going to want to develop your own methodology to keep all of your windows and tabs in order. I have mine, and we'll talk about that later, just to give you an example. But it's something that you're going to want to think about so that you're not constantly opening and closing windows. FHIR objects are normalized. That data isn't repeated. So as a result, there's a lot of links. Finally, please go spend some time on this website. It's going to take a little bit of time to get used to it, but once you get used to it, you can begin to fly around the website. And on that note, have a great day, and we'll see you in the next video.